The Grand Summit Bank building stood tall in the heart of Atlanta, Georgia, its sleek glass exterior reflecting the golden morning sun. Inside, the atmosphere was cool, modern, and businesslike. Customers in designer suits and elegant dresses moved between the mahogany-trimmed counters, engaging in quiet conversations with tellers about investments, loans, and high-end transactions. At first glance, everything seemed to run smoothly, but Will Smith knew better than to trust appearances. Dressed in a dark gray suit with a crisp white shirt, Will walked into the bank with an air of quiet authority. His posture was relaxed, his movements unhurried. To any outsider, he was just another well-dressed customer waiting for service. But in reality, he was the bank's owner, the man responsible for every employee's paycheck, every policy decision, every expansion plan. He had built Grand Summit Bank from the ground up, turning it into one of the most respected Black-owned financial institutions in the country. Today, he had come unannounced to personally observe the staff, to see how his customers were treated when no one knew who he was. And within minutes, he noticed a problem. Behind the counter, a middle-aged white woman with sharp blue eyes and a stiff posture stood near the manager's desk, observing the bank floor with hawk-like intensity. Sharon Wilkes, the branch manager, had worked at the bank for years, long before Will had acquired it. She prided herself on keeping things in order, but Will had received multiple reports that her definition of order meant something else entirely. She had a pattern of selectively enforcing rules, a pattern of treating Black customers with suspicion while rolling out the red carpet for wealthy white clients. And now she was staring directly at Will. He had barely stepped into the line when he felt her eyes on him. Her gaze lingered, shifting between his suit and his face as if something did not belong. Will remained calm, pulling out his phone and checking emails as the line moved forward. But out of the corner of his eye, he saw Sharon whispering to a teller. The young woman at the counter looked uncomfortable, her shoulders stiffening as Sharon's voice grew sharper. Will already knew what was happening. He had seen it before, too many times in too many places. A Black man in an expensive suit, standing alone, waiting for service. It was enough to raise alarms in minds poisoned by bias. He glanced around. No one else was being watched. The elderly white man depositing a check? Ignored. The young white woman in yoga pants withdrawing cash? Not a second glance. But him? He could feel the weight of Sharon's scrutiny, as if she were trying to place him, figure him out, categorize him. Then she made her move. She walked over, her heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. Stopping just a few feet away, she folded her arms, her expression tight. "Sir," she said, her voice dripping with forced politeness. "Can I help you with something?" Will looked up, offering a neutral smile. "No, thank you. I am just waiting in line." Her eyes flickered with something, irritation, disbelief. She was expecting him to fumble, to give an excuse for why he was there. She pressed on. "We typically require appointments for large transactions. Are you certain you are in the right place?" Will raised an eyebrow. There it was, the assumption that he could not possibly belong in a place like this. "Pretty sure I am," he said evenly. Her lips thinned. She hesitated, then spoke again. "May I ask what type of business you have here today?" Will exhaled slowly. He had given her every opportunity to approach him with respect. She had made her choice. He met her gaze directly. "Banking business." Her jaw tightened. "We require identification for all transactions." Will nodded, pulling out his black leather wallet and holding it up slightly. "That will not be a problem." Sharon did not look satisfied. "Excuse me for a moment," she muttered before turning sharply and marching back toward her desk. Will watched her go, already knowing what was coming next. Her hand reached for the phone. Her expression hardened. She glanced back at him once before turning away, as if confirming he was still there. And then, with a sickening sense of certainty, Will saw her dial 911. Will Smith remained in line, his expression unreadable as he watched Sharon Wilkes grip the phone at her desk. Her lips moved quickly as she spoke in a low, urgent tone. Though he could not hear her exact words, he already knew the script. A suspicious Black male inside a high-end bank. Standing in line for too long. Dressed too well, but not in a way that suggested he belonged. Unaccompanied, which made him even more suspect. She had already decided that he was either a criminal, a scammer, or a fraud. Will exhaled slowly, his grip tightening slightly around his wallet. This was not new. This had happened before. To him, to friends, to colleagues, to countless black men who had dared to exist in places they were not expected to be. A black man in a hoodie was a threat. A black man in a suit was a scammer. And in Sharon's eyes, he was the latter. Across the room, a teller named Lisa Carter shuffled nervously behind the counter. She had been working at Grand Summit Bank for only 6 months, but she had seen enough to know what was happening. She glanced toward Will. He did not look nervous. He did not look like someone who had done anything wrong. So why was Sharon calling the police? Lisa's stomach twisted as she turned to the teller beside her. Did you hear what she said? The other woman, a brunette in her mid-40s, shook her head. No, but I can guess. She lowered her voice. She has done this before. Last month, she questioned a black businessman withdrawing funds for a real estate purchase. She held his transaction for over an hour. He left in frustration. Lisa frowned. And no one reported her? The woman shrugged. Who would we report her to? She is the manager. Lisa's heart pounded as she stole another glance toward Will, who stood calmly, unaware of the storm about to hit. Sharon finished her call. She set the phone down, smoothed out her blazer, and made her way back toward the line. Her eyes locked on Will like a predator who had just secured her prey. Sir, she said, her voice suddenly louder than before, I need to ask you to step out of the line. The bank grew noticeably quieter. A few heads turned, customers exchanging glances. Will kept his posture relaxed. And why is that? Sharon straightened. We have security protocols in place. You have been standing in line for quite some time without making a transaction. I need to verify your identity. Will tilted his head. Is that your standard practice? Sharon's expression hardened. We apply the same policies to all customers. A few customers frowned. An elderly white man near the front of the line glanced back at Will, confused. He is just waiting in line, like the rest of us, he muttered. Lisa felt her pulse spike. Her throat was dry, but she forced herself to speak. Ms. Wilkes, I can assist him when it is his turn. Sharon shot her a warning look. This is a management matter, Lisa. Lisa hesitated but nodded, stepping back, her hands clenching into fists. Will remained still, but his silence was thunderous. His gaze never wavered from Sharon's face. Ma'am, he said slowly, I have been waiting patiently, just like everyone else. I have caused no disturbance. I have made no demands. I am standing in line for service, the same as your other customers. So I will ask you again, why are you singling me out? Sharon's face flushed. I am simply doing my job. Are you? Will asked, his voice steady. Because it seems like you are making assumptions based on something other than policy. Sharon's jaw clenched. Sir, I am going to have to ask you to leave. A hush fell over the room. Will exhaled slowly. And if I refuse? Sharon's smirk was slight, but it was there. Then law enforcement will handle the matter. Lisa's stomach plummeted. Sharon had made up her mind before she ever approached him. She wanted him out. Not because he had done something wrong, because he had existed in a space she did not believe he belonged in. Lisa took a step forward, her heart racing. Ms. Wilkes, maybe... The doors burst open. 2 uniformed police officers entered, their hands resting on their belts. Sharon stepped aside, her expression almost victorious as she gestured toward Will. That is him. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. Will remained still, his hands at his sides. His face was unreadable. One of the officers, a tall man with close-cropped hair, stepped forward. Sir, I need to see some identification. Will slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, holding it up so there would be no mistake. The officer took it, flipping it open, and then froze. His expression shifted instantly. His eyes darted back to Will, then down to the ID again. Sharon noticed the hesitation. She frowned. What is the problem? The officer hesitated, then turned toward her. Ma'am, he said slowly, did you even check his credentials before calling us? Sharon's smirk faltered slightly. Excuse me? The officer exhaled sharply and looked back at Will, his entire posture shifting from authority to unease. "Sir," he said, his tone much more careful now, "would you mind explaining your presence here today?" Will finally moved. He reached back into his pocket, this time pulling out a sleek black business card. He held it up. The gold embossed text caught the light. Grand Summit Bank, Will Smith, chairman and owner. Silence crashed over the bank like a wave. Lisa's eyes widened. Customers began whispering. Sharon's expression turned pale. Will tucked his business card back into his pocket and finally allowed himself to smile. "I am here," he said smoothly, "because I own this bank." The officer stiffened. Lisa covered her mouth. Sharon took a full step back. Will's smile widened. "And now," he said, "we are going to talk about exactly what that means for you." A heavy silence settled over Grand Summit Bank as Will Smith's words hung in the air. The whispers among customers grew louder. Employees behind the counter froze, their eyes darting between Will and the officers. Sharon Wilkes stood motionless, her face drained of color. Just moments ago, she had been so sure of herself, so convinced that she had been doing the right thing. But now, the man she had called the police on was not some criminal, not some scam artist. He was the owner of the very bank she worked at. The lead officer cleared his throat. His demeanor had shifted from authority to pure discomfort. "Sir," he said carefully, "I had no idea." Will held up a hand, stopping him. His expression was calm, controlled, but there was no mistaking the steel in his eyes. "Officer," he said smoothly, "do you typically respond to 911 calls about men standing in line at a bank?" The officer hesitated, his jaw tightening. "No, sir." Will nodded. "And did you receive any report of a crime, a disturbance, a policy violation?" The officer shook his head. "No, sir." Will turned his gaze back to Sharon. She had not moved. She stood frozen, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Will let the silence stretch, watching her squirm under the weight of her mistake. Lisa Carter, the young teller who had tried to step in earlier, felt her pulse hammering. Sharon Wilkes had spent months running this branch like a gatekeeper, deciding who was worthy of certain levels of service. And now in front of everyone, she had been exposed. Lisa glanced around. Customers watched with rapt attention, some murmuring in quiet outrage. One woman clutched her handbag, her lips pursed. A man near the counter shook his head in disgust. The very people Sharon had worked so hard to impress were now seeing her for exactly who she was. Lisa swallowed hard. She knew she had to speak up. Sharon finally found her voice. "Mr. Smith," she began, her tone forced and shaky. "This was all a misunderstanding. Will tilted his head slightly. "A misunderstanding?" Sharon nodded quickly. I did not know who you were." Will's eyes narrowed slightly. "And if I were not the owner? If I had been just another customer waiting in line?" Sharon's mouth opened, but no words came out. Lisa suddenly stepped forward. She took a deep breath, then spoke clearly. "Mr. Smith, she never checked your credentials before calling the police. She assumed you were a threat just because you were here." A murmur rippled through the bank. Will glanced at Lisa, his gaze unreadable. Sharon whipped around, her face tight with panic. "Lisa, that is not—" Lisa squared her shoulders. "You told me this was a management matter. You refused to let me assist him, even though I was prepared to do my job. You went straight to security because you saw a black man in a suit and decided he did not belong here." Sharon's breath hitched. The lead officer exhaled sharply, shaking his head. He turned toward Will. "Sir, if you wish to file a report regarding this incident, we will be happy to assist." Sharon's eyes widened. "A report?" Will studied her for a moment before shaking his head. "Number, I have other plans." Sharon visibly relaxed for a second. Then Will turned toward the rest of the bank staff. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice clear and authoritative, "since it seems many of you are unaware, allow me to formally introduce myself." He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a second business card, larger than the first. He set it on the counter in front of Lisa. The golden text gleamed under the overhead lights. "Will Smith, founder and chairman, Grand Summit Bank Corporation." A gasp rippled through the employees. Lisa's eyes widened as she read the card. Sharon staggered back, gripping the counter for support. Will clasped his hands together. I bought this bank 2 years ago. I oversee every branch. I employ every person in this building. And yet today, when I walked into my own institution, I was treated like I was committing a crime. The room remained eerily silent. Will exhaled. That raises a very important question. How many customers have been treated this way before me? Sharon blanched. I have received complaints about this branch, Will continued. Reports of selective service, of certain customers being given different levels of attention. Today, I saw it firsthand. Sharon tried to recover. Mr. Smith, please, I assure you. Will held up a hand, silencing her. You called the police on your own employer, he said. That tells me everything I need to know. Sharon finally broke. Her eyes filled with desperation. Sir, I did not mean... Will's voice was calm. Pack your things, Miss Wilkes. Sharon stilled. Lisa inhaled sharply. The entire bank fell into stunned silence. Sharon's mouth moved, but no sound came out. Will met her gaze directly. I no longer require your services. You are dismissed. The officers, clearly uncomfortable, took a step back, realizing this was no longer a police matter. Sharon, still frozen, looked toward the other employees. None of them spoke in her defense. Slowly, she realized she had no allies. Lisa took a deep breath and straightened. Justice had finally been served. Will gestured toward a security guard. Escort her out. The guard, a burly man in a Navy uniform, nodded once. Yes, sir. Sharon let out a strangled sound. Please, Mr. Smith, I have worked here for years. Will's expression remained unreadable. And in those years, you have shown exactly who you are. That is why you are no longer welcome in my bank. Sharon stared at him, eyes full of disbelief, before she was led toward the exit. Lisa released a breath she did not realize she had been holding. Will turned toward her. Thank you for speaking up, Miss Carter. Lisa's face warmed. It was the right thing to do. Will nodded. It was. He glanced toward the other employees. Let today be a lesson. This is a place of business, not a place of judgment. If any of you have a problem with that, you know where the door is. No one moved. Will adjusted his suit jacket. Good. He turned, stepping away from the counter and heading toward the exit. This time, with every eye in the building watching him, not in suspicion, but in awe. Sharon Wilkes had walked into work that morning believing she owned the space. She had been in control for years, deciding who received good service, who faced obstacles, and who did not belong. Now she was gone. The doors to Grand Summit Bank closed behind her as security escorted her out, her face a mask of disbelief and humiliation. The very people she had looked down on, her staff, the customers she dismissed, watched her leave without a word of sympathy. For the first time in years, Sharon Wilkes had no power, and everyone saw it. Inside the bank, the energy had completely shifted. Employees who had once walked on eggshells under Sharon's rule now exchanged glances, some with quiet relief, others still processing the moment. Lisa Carter, the young teller who had spoken up, exhaled slowly. Will Smith turned toward her. Ms. Carter, he said, his tone level but firm. Walk with me. Lisa straightened immediately. Yes, sir. They moved toward the bank's private offices, the murmur of staff and customers fading as they stepped inside. Will gestured for her to sit. He remained standing. You spoke up when you did not have to, he said. I noticed that. Lisa swallowed, feeling her pulse quicken. It was the right thing to do. It was, Will agreed. But doing the right thing is not always easy. He studied her for a moment before continuing. How long have you worked here? 6 months, sir. Will nodded. And in those 6 months, how many times have you seen what happened today? In some form or another. Lisa hesitated before answering. Too many. Will's gaze did not waver. And yet, no one reported it. Lisa shifted in her seat. Sir, with all due respect, who would we have reported it to? She was the manager. If anyone said anything, they risked losing their job. Will exhaled, understanding the weight of her words. Not anymore, he said firmly. Lisa met his eyes. Does that mean things will change? Will gave a small, knowing smile. They already have. Lisa nodded slowly, something lighter settling in her chest. By the time Will stepped back into the main lobby, word had spread. Customers had been watching everything unfold, whispering amongst themselves. Some had recorded clips of Sharon being escorted out. Others simply stood in quiet amazement. One man, a white customer in his 60s, wearing a tailored business suit, stepped forward. "Mr. Smith?" Will turned to him. "Yes?" The man offered a firm handshake. "My name is Charles Morton. I have been a customer here for years. And I have to say, what you did today, that was long overdue." Will shook his hand. "I appreciate that, Mr. Morton." Charles nodded. "I run a law firm downtown. I have seen this kind of thing play out in courtrooms, in businesses, in boardrooms. People like her always believe they are untouchable." Will's expression remained steady. "Until they are not." Charles smiled slightly. "Indeed." He released the handshake and glanced toward the exit. "I imagine she will not be the only one reconsidering how they treat people after today." Will did not respond, but he did not have to. He had sent a message, loud and clear. As the day wound down, Will returned to his corporate office, overlooking downtown Atlanta. He settled into his chair, loosening his tie slightly as he reached for his phone. A long day, but a necessary one. His assistant, Michelle Parker, knocked lightly before stepping inside. "Sir, I have the preliminary reports from this morning's visit." Will nodded. "Anything stand out?" Michelle gave him a knowing look. "Besides the obvious." Will smirked. "Besides that," she set the folder on his desk. "Employee reports indicate that Sharon Wilkes had been a long-standing problem. Customer complaints about her behavior were either ignored or dismissed. Several employees considered leaving because of her." Will sighed, flipping through the pages. "She was a liability." Michelle nodded. "Yes, and if today had not happened, she would have continued to be." Will closed the folder and leaned back. "You know what the real shame is?" he said after a moment. Michelle waited. "She had every opportunity to do the right thing," Will said, "to treat people with dignity, to be better." He shook his head. "But she made a choice." Michelle nodded slowly. "And you made yours." Will met her gaze. "I did." A pause. Michelle tilted her head slightly. "Sir, if you do not mind me asking, why did you not tell her who you were from the start?" Will smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Because," he said, "I wanted to see if she would make that choice on her own." Michelle exhaled. "And she failed." Will nodded. "Miserably." That night, as Will left his office and stepped onto the streets of downtown Atlanta, the city lights glowing against the night sky, he reflected on everything that had happened. A lesson had been taught today, not just to Sharon Wilkes, but to everyone who had been watching. He had fought his entire life to build something meaningful, something powerful, and no amount of bias, ignorance, or small-minded thinking would ever change that. As he walked toward his car, his phone buzzed in his pocket, a text from an unknown number. "The way you handled today was impressive. The right people are paying attention. Let's talk." Will stared at the message for a long moment. Then slowly, he smiled. Because if today had proven anything, it was this. Change was coming, and Will Smith was leading the way. The next morning, Grand Summit Bank opened its doors as usual. Customers walked in, tellers greeted them, transactions continued. But something was different. The tension that had once lingered in the air under Sharon Wilkes' authority was gone. Employees no longer whispered about unfair treatment, and customers no longer exchanged wary glances. A shift had taken place, one that could not be undone. Will Smith stood near the corner office window of his corporate headquarters, overlooking the city skyline. He had spent his career building this institution, not just as a place for financial success, but as a place where Black entrepreneurs, working-class families, and everyday citizens could feel valued. Yesterday had proven something critical. There was still work to do. Michelle Parker stepped into his office, holding her tablet. "Sir, we have received over 40 customer messages since last night. Most of them are praising how you handled the situation." Will nodded, unsurprised. "And the employees?" he asked. Michelle smiled slightly. "Relieved." Many of them said they feel like they can breathe again. Will exhaled. Good. She hesitated. There is something else. Will turned. She handed him a printed email. A letter of apology from Sharon Wilkes. Will skimmed the contents. Mr. Smith, I take full responsibility for my actions. I made a mistake, one I deeply regret. I have had time to reflect, and I realize now that I acted out of bias and assumption rather than fairness and policy. I know this apology cannot undo what happened, but I wanted to acknowledge my failure. Sincerely, Sharon Wilkes will place the letter on his desk, his expression unreadable. Do you believe her? Michelle asked. Will tapped his fingers against the desk, thinking. I believe she regrets getting caught. Michelle nodded slowly. What do you want to do? Will folded the letter neatly in half and slid it into a drawer. Nothing, he said. She made her choice. She will live with it. Later that afternoon, Will returned to the same Grand Summit branch. Employees stiffened slightly when they saw him walk in, unsure if this was a follow-up or an inspection. He approached Lisa Carter, the teller who had spoken up. Ms. Carter, he said. Lisa straightened. Yes, sir. Will set a small envelope on the counter. A promotion. You are now an assistant branch manager. Lisa's eyes widened. I do not know what to say, she stammered. Will smiled. Then do what you did yesterday. Speak the truth. Lisa's throat tightened. Thank you, sir. Will nodded. Congratulations. As he turned to leave, customers watched in admiration, because today they were not just looking at a banker. They were looking at a leader. And that was real power.